Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. We are going to continue the discussion started last week about what complexion Jesus Christ was. Today, we will focus on the Black Hebrew claims because there has been a surge of these ideas in recent years. When I examined these claims a number of years ago, I was actually surprised at how this particular claim lacked any semblance of scholarship. There are only two primary sources provided for this claim, and the rest of the evidence is based on inferences. The first primary source is Revelation chapter 1, verse 14 through 15. This reads, quote, "His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters," unquote. Depending on the Bible version used, some will describe his feet as bronze, which is identified as a brown color. Of course, this is taking the whole passage out of context, since the very next clause says his feet were as if they burned in a furnace. So the description is more of a red-hot color. Various commentaries depict the feet as luminous, bright and dazzling, as glistening white, as brass fresh out of the hot furnace. This matches the description of his eyes and his flames of fire, and of course referring to his head and his hairs as white as wool. The Black Israelite idea provided other verses, such as Daniel 10, 5 through 6, and Ezekiel 1, verse 7, but these passages are describing the exact same thing. The only other primary source I have seen for this argument, I don't think it's appropriate to call it a primary source. It is claimed to be a quote from the Old Slavonic version of Josephus, wherein the description of Jesus is found. The quote that is often offered is as follows, quote, "At that time also there appeared a certain man of magic powers, if it be meet to call him a man, whose name is Jesus, whom certain Greeks call a son of a god, but his disciples call the true prophet, who is supposed to have raised dead persons and to have cured all diseases. Both his nature and his form were human, for he was a man of simple appearance, mature age, black skin, short growth, 3 cubits tall, hunchbacked, prognathous, a long nose, eyebrows meeting above the nose, that the spectators could take fright, with scanty curly hair, but having a line in the middle of the head after the fashion of the Nazarenes, with an undeveloped beard," unquote. The problem with this quote is it's not from the passage describing Jesus in the Slavonic version of Josephus. When I plugged the quote into the search engine, it only showed results advocating the Black Jesus websites. AI informed me that it is a forged quote originating from Robert Eisler's 1931 book, The Messiah, Jesus, and John the Baptist. Apparently, Eisler produced a reconstruction, not a translation of the Slavonic text. Working with a critical assumption that Josephus must have said something negative about Jesus, Eisler translates the Slavonic back into Greek, and then the Greek into Aramaic, to produce a version that exists nowhere in the world except his own conjectures. F. Bruce provides an accurate translation of the true Slavonic version of Josephus in his book, Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament. The discussion follows page 43 through 53. The same translated text is also found in Robert E. Van Voorst's Jesus Outside of the New Testament, pages 85 and 86. Vorst and Bruce both mention no serious scholar accepts the Slavonic version of Josephus as an accurate version because it is filled with multitudes of corruptions. This is a lengthy quote, but this is what the real Slavonic version reads. Quote, "At that time a man came forward, if even it is fitting to call him a man simply. His nature as well as his form were a man's, but his showing forth was more than that of a man. His works, that is to say, were godly, and he wrought wonder deeds amazing and full of power. Therefore, it is not possible for me to call him a man simply, but again, looking at the existence he shared with all, I would not call him an angel. Continuing this quote, and all that he wrought through some kind of invisible power, he wrought by word and command. Some said of him that our first lawgiver was risen from the dead and shows forth many cures and arts, but others supposed less definitely that he is sent by God. Now he opposed himself in much to the law and did not observe the Sabbath according to ancestral custom. Yet, on the other hand, he did nothing reprehensible, nor any crime, but by word solely he effected everything. This quote continues, and many from the folk followed him and received his teachings, and many souls became wavering, supposing that thereby the Jewish tribes would set themselves free from the Roman hands. Now, it was his custom often to stop on a Mount of Olives facing the city, and there also he avouched his cures to the people, and there gathered themselves to him of servants 150, but of the folk a multitude. Further continuing this quote, but when they saw his power, that he accomplished everything that he would by word, they urged him that he should enter the city and cut down the Roman soldiers and Pilate and rule over us. But that one scorned it. And thereafter, when knowledge of it came to the Jewish leaders, they gathered together with the high priest and spake, we are powerless and weak to withstand the Romans. But as withal the bow is bent, we will go and tell Pilate what we have heard, and we will be without distress, lest if he hear it from others, we be robbed of our substance, and ourselves be put to the sword, and our children ruined. Again, continuing this quote, and they went and told it to Pilate, and he sent and had many of the people cut down, and he had the wonder doer brought up, and when he had instituted a trial concerning him, he received that he is a doer of good, but not an evildoer, nor a revolutionary, nor one who aimed at power and set him free. He had, you should know, healed his dying wife. And this is the last portion of this quote as it continues. And he went to his accustomed place and wrought his accustomed works. And as again more folks gathered themselves together around him, then did he win glory through his works more than all. The teachers of the law were therefore envenomed with envy, and gave 30 talents to Pilate in order that he should put him to death. And he, after he had taken the money, gave them consent that they should themselves carry out their purpose. And they took him and crucified him according to the ancestral law. Unquote. Now, anyone familiar with the Greek or Latin version of the Josephus Testimonium can see this Slavonic version is ridiculously corrupted. Yet, it is also clearly not what is being quoted to defend Jesus as black. Some websites supporting the Black Jesus proposal have citations from Henry Field, who was the curator of the Field Museum of Natural History from 1926 to 1934. The claim is that Africans originated Mesopotamia, and the Jews are closely related to Africans. The problem with this is Henry Field was a racist, presenting Jews and blacks as inferior to whites. His ideas were used in Nazi propaganda to argue this very point. It is ironic that black people today arguing for Black Jesus by using evolutionary ideologies that forged the pseudo-historical opinion when these arguments originally viewed the blacks and Jews as inferior to whites. Another point that has been presented makes reference to the book of 1st Enoch, alleging that white people are Nephilim. Once again, we find comments made from someone who obviously has not read the original text, at least not very closely. The Ethiopian version of 1st Enoch has the passage as referenced as chapter 105, verses 1 through 3, but the more popular eclectic text found in James Charlesworth's edition of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha has the passage in chapter 106, verses 1 through 3. This relates how Lamech's wife gave birth to Noah, who was white and glowing with light. Lamech, who was the father, thought he was a Nephilim and called Enoch. Enoch therefore reveals that this indeed was Lamech's son, who was to be named Noah, and he would preserve the human race from God's judgment on the Nephilim. So if this text is supposedly interpreted as an example of white Nephilim, the whole human race would therefore be descended from Noah after the flood, and that would make everyone a white Nephilim. This is the type of fictitious misinterpretation coming from Black Jesus historians. Most of the arguments for Black Jesus are inferences, that is, indirect evidence for the claim. For example, it is commonly, very commonly claimed Egypt is in Africa, so Egyptians must be black. And since the Jews frequently sought refuge in Egypt, it must be because they were also black and could blend in with the Black Egyptian population. For example, one Black Jesus website states, quote, in 70 AD, the Romans invaded Israel, causing millions of Israelites to escape to Africa. In his book, The Great Roman Jewish War, 66 to 70, the Roman historian Flavius Josephus stated over thousands of years ago that the Israelites migrated into Africa. He writes, quote, General Vespasian and his son Caesar Titus fought against the Jews. Millions of Jews fled into Africa, among other places, fleeing from Roman persecution and starvation during the siege, unquote. There are a number of errors in this statement. First, Josephus was a Jewish historian, not a Roman historian. Second, the title of his work was The Jewish Wars, not the Great Roman Jewish War. Third, the works under the title was actually 7 books. Fourth, there's no specific source to identify this alleged quote, which makes it suspicious off the bat. Fifth, the war actually occurred between 66 AD to 73 AD, ending with Rome conquering Masada, not Rome conquering Jerusalem in 70 AD. 6. In all the extant writings of Josephus, he never once used the word Africa. But when we look again at this quotation, allegedly from Josephus, it says the Jews fled into Africa. 7th, again looking at the alleged quotation from Josephus, it reads, General Vespasian and his son Caesar Titus. But Vespasian was the general when the siege on Jerusalem started, but the siege was interrupted and Vespasian became Caesar, then sent his son Titus to finish the war, who was the general at the time. Now, Titus did become Caesar after his father's death, but from how this quote stands, it makes Vespasian a mere general and Titus his son, the Caesar, while the war was taking place. An obvious historical error. 8th, from what I can determine, this quote is not even in Josephus, but originates from a book titled Will a Nation Be Born in One Day? From Slaves to a Nation of Spiritual Warriors by Alicia Fenton Greenaway. However, to argue that Jews fled to Egypt because they blended in with the black population is also problematic. Egypt has always been a melting pot, just like America is. The Supiliu Luemius Annals in ancient Near Eastern texts related to the Old Testament, page 319, records a letter from the widowed queen of Egypt who requested a son from the Hittite king to be her husband, since she had no son from her deceased husband and was ashamed to take one of her servants to make him king. The Greek author Herodotus, in his Histories, Book 2, paragraph 154, relates that Psammetichus established 2 camps for Ionians and Carians to teach Egyptian children the Greek language so that they can become translators, and King Amasis settled Greeks in the city of Memphis. Egypt was a logical location to flee for the Jews during the war and famine for 2 reasons. One, since Israel was located with the sea to their west and the desert to their immediate east, invading armies could only enter from the north or south. Obviously, if the army came from the north, Israel would flee to the south into Egypt. Secondly, during famines, which were also caused by wars or droughts, they went to Egypt because the harvest in Egypt was based on the annual flooding of the Nile River instead of rain. So while most nations in the area were affected by the lack of rain, all those nations went to Egypt for food. But it should also be noted that it was not only Egypt that the Jews fled to, and Josephus records them fleeing to the mountains, or Idumea, or Tiberias, or more general, just simply quote-unquote foreign provinces. Furthermore, Egypt had a large permanent Jewish population from an early period in history. Aramaic writings have been discovered in ancient Elephantine Egypt, discussing how to celebrate the Passover, and these texts dated to 419 BC, as well as Jewish marriage contracts as early as 459 BC. Translation of these texts can be read in ancient Near Eastern texts related to the Old Testament. Philo, a first century Jew living in Alexandria, Egypt, wrote, quote, knowing that the city, Alexandria, Egypt, had two classes of inhabitants, our own nation, referring to the Jews, and the people of the country, and that the whole of the Jews who inhabited Alexandria and the rest of the country from Catabathmos on the side of Libya to the boundaries of Ethiopia were no less than 1 million of men, unquote. In fact, the city of Alexandria, Egypt, was established by none other than Alexander the Great, and he purposely migrated a number of Jews into the city, so they were there in the population from the very beginning and establishment of the city. Philo also comments on the large Jewish population of the city of Alexandria in the first century. He states, quote, there are 5 districts in the city, named after the first 5 letters of the written alphabet. Of these, 2 are called the quarters of the Jews because the chief portion of the Jews live in them. There are also a few scattered Jews, but only a very few living in some of the other districts, unquote. Furthermore, art from ancient Egypt shows the diversity of skin tones existed in Egypt. As we look at this image, we have darker Nubians. The local Egyptians are generally depicted with tan skin and no beards. The Egyptians could have varying tones, as you can tell by the various people who have no beards. This would depict their economic class. Those working outside are tanner. Higher classes would have servants to do their labor, so would be lighter in their skin tone. This image provides an evidence of darker skin tone apparently acting as servants to the women with lighter skin tone. The lighter skin tone during certain historical periods would have been viewed as the mark of beauty, and some could be artificial. That is to say, they used makeup to actually lighten their skin color. And in this image, we have men with beards being depicted. These would likely be foreigners, not actual Egyptians, because the Egyptians shaved all of their hair off. These images are Semitic people from the north representing Israel and Syria. The various shade and tones used by ancient Egyptian art usually shows how they viewed themselves in comparison to the immediate neighbors around them. And of course, the one with the darkest skin tone would be a Nubian, probably representing Ethiopia. Clearly, Egypt was a melting pot of various skin tones and colors, so Israel was hiding in its population was not because they were black. Last week I mentioned Moses' wife called an Ethiopian in Numbers 12, verse 1. I suggested since her father was a Midian priest, it is probably that her mother was Ethiopian. The Hebrew calls her a Cushi, that is a Cushite, one descended from Cush, the son of Ham. But Cush had many sons dispersed in various lands after Babel. Nimrod, whose beginning of his kingdom was Babel, in Genesis 10, verse 10, was a son of Cush. So Mesopotamia had Cushites. Also important to note is Cush's son Ra'ama had 2 sons, Sheba and Dedan, in Genesis 10, verse 7. These 2 would live in modern-day Saudi Arabia, which is also the location of the ancient Midianite. Habakkuk 3 verse 7 says, quote, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble, unquote. This parallels Cushan and Midian because Midianites were descendants of Cush. Furthermore, the book of Jubilee, chapter 9, verse 1, locates Cush's descendants east of Egypt, which would be modern-day Saudi Arabia, not south, which would depict Ethiopia. So the east of Egypt would be ancient Midian. With all this, Moses' wife being called a Cushite does not inform definitively she was an Ethiopian. The stronger evidence would lean to the simple fact that she was a Midianite, since her father was Jethro, the priest of Midian. In conclusion, assessing the Black Israelite idea falls far from any valid expression of truth. This is due to the poor interpretation of scriptural verses they use in their argument, using invalid sources, such as this bogus quote from the supposed Slavonic Josephus. The other historical sources they present are inadequately supported as inferences that the Jews fled to Egypt under the wrong assumption that the Egyptians were black. And of course, faulty sources and selective reporting proves the idea is simply wrong. But the big question is, why does it matter? Are some black people only willing to accept Jesus if he is black? I know Jesus was not a white European like me, and that does not bother me for a second. I would put my faith in the Lord Jesus Christ no matter what color his skin was. At the end of the day, Jesus is the Son of God, Lord of all. God manifests in the flesh. Whatever skin color God chose to have for the incarnation will not hinder me from placing my faith in his death, burial, and resurrection for the salvation from my sins. Jesus was a Jew. Whether painting him as a black African or a blue-eyed white European with long hippie hair is historical revisionism, and it's idolatry. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com. Because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.